Dhaval Jani. I'm a user experience lead working with Accenture. Um, I've worked in designing about, I want to say, 15 to 18 years. The reason I say 15 to 18 because part of it I was part-time and then back full-time. So while I was not involved full-time, I was still doing little freelance work on the side. So I've been in this industry for that long. Yeah.
Great. And then can you tell us about what disability or disabilities you have?
Sure. So I have polio, which affects my lower left extremity. So my left leg, all the way down my waist, is smaller than my right leg. So I'm 5'6", now 5'5". So when I walk, I use a full leg brace, and I use a crutch, and I limp. I have visible limp quite a bit, and yeah. So that's what I initially started out with. A few years back, I want to say about 6 years ago, I ended up having a car accident, which ended up injuring my left index finger and the thumb. My thumb is recovered. I was like hyper, like I was almost double jointed, so I could hyperextend and flex certain joints. So now I've lost that ability on my thumb, so I can't do funny tricks. But then my index finger doesn't extend fully and like doesn't contract fully. So it's legally classified as a partial disability. But I'm so used to it. Like now, there are certain things I feel more like limitations, but like it's not as big as my phobia.
Do you want to tell us more about what limitations you experienced?
In general or
Yeah.
specifically?
Yeah,
Okay.
in general.
So it's funny because I got polio when I was about 2 years old. So I don't have too much of a memory of my life without polio. I recall like vaguely running around and stuff like any little kid do, but then I don't know what, where, how. So I don't have any memories. So it has not impacted my life much because I have lived with it for my life. Progressively, it has gotten to the point where I need more assistive devices, or like I didn't used to use a cane or a crutch until I was 26, 27. I'm 38 now. So I use the crutch. I started having back pain and stuff, and so the physiotherapist and the doctors recommended that I started using it so I don't have to put too much pressure on my spine and like lean too much on one side, so to balance out. So for longer distances, I started using crutch. But yeah, in terms of day-to-day activities, only thing I like as a kid, and like even as a grown-up, I feel I can't do or I wish I could do is ride a bike. So, but other than that, it has not polio has not impacted much. I'm used to like this is my normal.
Okay. And thank you for sharing all of that with me. Um, how has your disability impacted the way that you design, what you think about, your design processes, and anything else in between?
Sure. So it's funny, as I guess when I got started, I didn't pay as much attention. I was mindful about certain things, but not in terms of like accessibility, just general user experience, because I'm like, okay, are users going to like it, or are they going to perform certain actions that they want to? But then I was just thinking of larger bucket of everyone. And um, uh, I guess I'm a little embarrassed to say, I was completely ignoring accessibility. I was being mindful of color contrast and things like that. Even before I knew the term accessibility and the reason of color contrast, I was just focusing on higher visibility and like, what do we call it? Just reach, because when I started with print and board, like sign designs as well. So big hoardings when you're passing on a road, the contrast has to be substantial, otherwise, and the font sizes have to be substantial, otherwise it's not obvious. So that's what I brought into the digital and like web as well. So yeah, I did a lot of graphic design, and that's where I was being mindful, but was not paying attention to accessibility at all. Up until later, when I was introduced like with people who faced other disabilities that um, were different from mine, because my disability is, like I said, is a mobility disability. It does not impact like things that I do with my hands until I got until I injured my hand. And so my hands and like my eyes, I don't have any vision or hearing or other disabilities that impact me. So unless I guess until I put myself in that situation, I would not be mindful. Or if I had immediate family or friends who were going through that situation, I would not be mindful. So I was not mindful initially. But then like I said, I got into contact with other people, and then I saw how they were struggling or what they were struggling with, and then I started digging more into it, and then started paying more attention.
With your finger injury, has it ever impacted the way that you interacted with the mobile device?
It has. So it's funny, like because I use a crutch with my right hand, my left hand becomes my primary hand to do everything else. So like carrying groceries or opening doors or lifting things or a bunch of things that you typically use both hands for, I use my left hand, and which is what I ended up injuring in the car accident. So when I'm walking or doing certain things, I would be using my left hand as my primary hand to use my phone. And ever since I heard it, my thumb is not as flexible as it used to be. It's still flexible. So now I still use my phone with my left hand. I'm back to using it. But then I cannot use it for a prolonged time. So if I like to go on hikes and things like that. So it's funny, like mobile device as in phone, I don't use it as much because I used to use that as a trigger for, I like photography, so as a trigger for remote as well. But then I switched to physical triggers because it's a lot more tactile and it gives better feedback than low sensitivity to my finger or touch. So it has impacted like how I use certain things, maybe for a prolonged period of time, or like maybe just use it for certain things, but not as much. Like previously, I'm not. I don't use both my hands to draw, but like on phones, just to scribble things, I would often use my left hand thumb to scribble. Now, fine motor skills are not at where they used to be, so I don't scribble with my left hand.
Do you think that your limitations with your hand and whatnot, do you think that's impacted the way that you've had your designs, like what you consider when you're looking at your UI designs?
It has. It has quite a bit. So what's funny is prior to my injury, I had worked on and like wearable designs. I had worked on first WatchOS app when Apple first came out with Watch, and then it was very clunky. It was just more like, oh, there's this new cool product, but it was not as usable. It couldn't do much, like play pause and stuff. It was kind of like a remote. But what's funny is like I've noticed I use more and more voice assisted devices. So I use chatbots and stuff to remind us when I'm walking around or doing things. I've used wearables to do certain things, and I use gestures more often than like going through everywhere. Normally on my computer, other than pin, zoom, or swipe, I don't use other gestures. I disable some of the gestures on certain things. But on my phone also, like there are fun gestures which I typically don't use. But then in terms of like watch, if I have to unlock or if I have to like do certain things with my phone, I use that other ways to interact. I've noticed I prominently like use voice if there's not too many people around, because I don't like to say out loud commands when people are around me. But otherwise, when I'm walking or hiking or something, I definitely use voice more than I did before. I don't know if it's just implementing the voice, understanding my commands, or it's just both, combination of both, but me not having to pull out my phone and do certain things and just being able to talk and have my hands free, or one hand free.
Yeah, makes sense. You said earlier it wasn't until you had met other people with disabilities that kind of opened your eyes to accessibility. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. There's like two different people that I want to call out. I have a friend. she's a model turned photographer, and she has a disability where she can't hear or speak. So I first met her probably, I want to say 12, 13 years ago. And back then, T-Mobile Sidekick was a big thing, where like, a lot of teenagers were using Sidekick to text. But I noticed that her and like through her, I met a bunch of her friends who had the same disability, and Sidekick was heavily used by all of them because it was such a good, fast way to let them text compared to old school phones where you had to press like, you had numeric keypad and you had to press like, if you wanted to say hi, you had to press like, I want to say three times three, 2 times 3 to say age, and then 2 times. So it was much more complicated to type until like, those keyboards arrived. So I noticed that, they were using that, and they were using other devices or other, what do we call it? More other devices that would detect certain sounds and signals, which were not like, I was not familiar with it. Like, I didn't think of certain things that would be such a big deal for other people. Like, as in, if I was to stay in a hotel, if there was an alarm flashing, I would be like, okay, yeah, there's an emergency, I need to get out. For them, if they don't know that, I think, certain hotels provide some vibration-based devices or some other, like, more stronger flashes or something, or the placement of the light is in a way where it would be covering the whole room versus instead of just the entrance of the door or something. So up until then, I didn't realize, like what challenges they might be facing. So that's one person I want to call out, my friend, who introduced me to that world. And what's funny is me coming in from India, and sometimes, when I'm watching, like, we all use captions or subtitles for certain foreign movies and stuff. And but then I saw that, there's a difference between subtitles that we watch versus if there is like closed captioning, which is more descriptive about certain things that sounds that happen in the background and things like that. So that's when I just learned more about like those, the importance of being as descriptive about certain things, learn from my contact with them. And I want to call out one more person. That person is my mom's cousin. He passed away recently. But he was blind, and growing up, we would see him for vacations, and when we go to vacations or family gatherings and things like that. And that's when I first saw Braille and how you type using, or like write using Braille pen, or like it's a pointer thing. And so it was very interesting to see that. But then over there, I recall like helping him with some creating cassette tapes. So back then, like they would get, if they wanted to study any advanced subjects, they might not get books or notes. So people would take notes for them, and like, somebody would read the notes to them, and often they would ask to record on a tape so they could do revisions for exams and things like that. So I would help record messages and stuff. And then, as technology grew, I saw him switch to an MP3 player, and then now being able, up until recently, he was able to use the phone and do certain things with phones. So like these two people, when I met with them and saw how they use technology and how bad design impacts like their life and them not being able to use technology, is when I started being more mindful.
That's great, and again, thank you so much for sharing. So what's one thing, knowing these, how bad design can actually be when it comes to accessibility, what's something that you wish more designers adopted into their own design practices?
I could go on and on and on, but including myself, like not just other designers. Sometimes, it's hard to be mindful or prioritize based on certain situations, maybe it's the timeline or the budget, or just like lack of priority, right? Because we don't put ourselves, or we don't know individual users. So that's where I feel like, we tend to ignore. But I feel like one thing that all designers could do is, if their product is built for larger audiences, that's going to, like if it's like a public website or an e-commerce website, that's not catered for like B2B. It's not business to business only, where certain limited users that might be internal staff or anyone else, if they are creating any materials that's going to be used by everyone, then don't do the same mistakes. Don't make the same mistakes I did, where I say, general, everyone is like, kind of being able to see everything, and like accessibility is such a small percentage. But I would say, look into maybe creating a persona. Like, if you have flexibility, if you are creating like 5 or 7 personas of like for a shopping website, if you're creating personas that also are very trendy and ordering on Alexa, maybe you also need to look at a persona that has some sort of disability, and then you'll be able to, I guess, empathize more with that particular disability, and how you can make certain things accessible or how it impacts them. You'll be able to feel better. So I would say maybe look into creating personas first, and then go down.
Great. Anything else that you wish designers would do, or?
Yeah,
or
like
too
I said,
many
you
to
have to
count?
keep going. I'll give an example. Such a small part of my, like, I'm not even primarily right. I'm right-handed. I'm not even left-handed. But in index finger and thumb, like the way I would extend and start typing again impacted where how far the keys were for certain shortcuts on different tools I was using. So now, if I was not able to configure those shortcuts to be something else, like Command C, Command V, or Control C, Control V, most use shortcut. It's helpful, like, and that was fine. But if I wanted to do something else, like Command T to open a new tab, it was like forcing me to extend my finger beyond my reach. So I ended up getting for the very first year or so, I ended up getting external touchpad, or like not touchpad, but more like it's a. Let me see if I can remember the actual name of the device. It's more almost like it's a keyboard for foot, but it's not full foot keyboard. It has just like shift and command, and like it has 3 or 4 buttons which you can what do we call it, program to use certain shortcuts, certain combination of shortcuts. So I started with that, but then again, having one leg which is limited, so I would just rely on another. But then I've seen certain softwares that allow you to just customize your shortcuts and like set up certain things. Or like I noticed, I would use like tabbing and shift tabbing a lot more than I did previously. So I did start learning programming as well way back when I started designing. So there are times, I'm just being lazy, where I'm only using keyboard for some things, or I'm using mouse, depending on what is closest to me and how lazy or how comfortable I am. But I guess since I injured myself, like I feel like I've been paying more attention to certain things, and I try to stay within the vicinity of certain shortcuts that are within the reach. So I would say give users flexibility to do certain things they want. So when we think of configurations on designs, right, like people think of, let's say, if you make a flexible page where you can drag and drop certain things and you can configure the page in a way. So like, this is like old school software development. Let me see. Where if you had reports, or if you had like a portal or like a software that was there, you could choose where you want the menu to be, or you could choose how you want certain things to be showing up. So I feel like, a lot of those things, give users flexibility to do certain things in multiple ways. Even in a website, like a lot of websites give you keyboard shortcuts. So think of giving keyboard shortcuts to navigate, not just tabbing, because tabbing is like very slow, I guess I would want to say, in certain situations. So yeah, if you want to, I would say give users flexibility to do certain things, and give them more customization options than you would think you would need. But again, that would vary from user to user, so you'll have to see you'll have to go case by case. But I would say make things flexible where they could use. So like to answer your previous question about apps and stuff, how it has affected my phone. So one thing is phone usage. So one thing I had done for a while, where I don't know if most phones provide this, but I'm used to LG phones, and what they would do is they have an option which is one-handed use option, so it shrinks the whole screen to a smaller like 70% or something. And so then it's within one thumb's reach because the phones have gotten bigger and bigger. So like when I'm not typing but just browsing instructions, I scale it down to that. And being able to use the apps that support that is very good. So when I'm typing, I need bigger keyboards. So I switch to full. But a lot of times, if I'm just doing one-handed, like so designers who are being mindful of apps that are also responsive, like not just or scale properly, or like websites. When we think of responsiveness, we just think of phone screen size, but we think of beyond that, like percentage, or design for even smaller phone size, like iPhones, smaller iPhones, or things like that. I think that's still going to be helpful to use a decent amount of audiences. So, yeah, I think I would say give flexibility and scale your designs to make it work on even extreme conditions, I'd say.
I wasn't aware of that feature. That's actually really cool. I could probably use that myself. So on that same subject, and especially considering flexibility, is there more that you wish employers did for people with disabilities or would implement within their structure?
That's a very good question. Yeah, and I think I'm not, I would advocate for it, but I'm not qualified enough to speak for everyone and their needs. I would say needs are very heavily based on employee to employee, depending on what type of disability they face. I would say at least giving them equal opportunity to be able to work in a certain situation. So to give you an example, when I got injured, when I injured my hand, for a while, I couldn't use my computer for a prolonged period of time. So my thumb would swell up, my finger would swell up when I would work more than 2-3 hours. And I'm not even a programmer, I'm a designer. So my keyboard usage is not going to be as drastic only when you're typing content or doing certain things. But then a lot of times, you're holding shift too long to drag certain things, or you repetitively do certain activities that are not strenuous to normal users or normal people. So having the flexibility of breaking my day into smaller chunks, or extending my day beyond 8 hours, maybe sometimes I would take 10 hours and take 4 half-an-hour breaks. So employers could just, it's not just always about providing devices or technology, but also just being there and providing employees a way for them to be able to contribute and perform closest to what they would expect from all other employees would be helpful. Also, not treating disabled employees differently. I think any disabled person doesn't want to be treated as a disabled person. I appreciate when people are being helpful and holding doors and doing certain things for me. But sometimes I also feel awkward about people going out of their way. Yes, everyone is nice, but people going out of their way to help me, and in a situation where I might not need help. So even for employers, I guess, just to check their boxes, or I've seen bigger companies fortunately don't do that. Smaller companies, I've seen two extremes. One is, I've faced times where I would be going for interviews, or I'll be working in a certain situation, and I know companies would pull me back from certain client-facing activities because they probably I have visible disability, and they probably care about putting their glamorous image in front of people.
Yeah.
And didn't register to me until a while where I was not getting certain opportunities. I've been very lucky at Accenture and SAP. Bigger companies, they don't care. I've been at client meetings. I've been leading even engagements for business development and stuff, meeting clients early on before we got the business. So I've been lucky. But I've seen, like I said, two extreme. One is, either they don't consider them equal, or sometimes they try to highlight the employees so much just to look good, that they are being inclusive and they are being nice. So they try to over publicize their efforts for inclusion and Um, Accessibility.
Right.
So I would say employers should look at like individual case by case and see how they can help. Definitely, assistive devices like as giving accessible keyboards and stands to adjust the height and chairs and everything else uh, is definitely like one should expect and employees should do regardless of disability, right? Like ergonomics, paying attention to ergonomics is something that employees should do regardless of disability, because you want employees to be comfortable when they're working. But in case of disability, give them more choices. Don't just rely on one portal and say, okay, pick any of these keyboards. Maybe give them an option. Say if you are disabled, like maybe if you need any other assistive devices, contact, or like sometimes contact is more difficult, but maybe just say, hey, if you need a keyboard, we are spending up to $200 for normal keyboard. Maybe you can buy a keyboard up to $200 and we reimburse you or something. So assistive devices and ergonomics, I would say all employers should pay attention to, but I would say pay attention to psychological aspect and comfort too, like not advertise your disabled employees, but at the same time don't hide them behind the like this glossy persona of you being like very modern, trendy, and like fit and healthy, normal company. So I would say give everyone equal opportunity that you give to normal people. Is how employers can be mindful.
I think those are all really good items to consider. I know in this past year we've all been working from home, but considering a time where we were in the office or when we go back to the office, was there anything that you wish people were more mindful of in physical spaces?
Yeah, I think most people I've run into are very nice and good. They have not been there has not been any issues that I personally face. But I know, going back to my deaf friend, even though she can't hear, she would rely a lot on reading lips. So in certain situations, now with COVID, the masks and everything, I know it has been a challenge. It has been publicized, but that's something when I interact, I see, like previously when we would, what do we call it, interact on a video chat or something, that would be something a lot more easier. So in video chat, mask is fine, but then going back to the office for certain employees, I'm sure there could be other things that could be looked into. I know Google has been doing a great job in terms of live transcribing phones and things like that. So there might be live transcribing things that could be done even for presentations and stuff in the office that we put for other employees. For myself, I guess, I've been lucky, like as I've not had any sensory disabilities. So it has not been as difficult for me compared to some of the other people who would have other disabilities.
Thank you so much for this. Is there anything, as we're wrapping this up, anything else that you would like to add in addition, anything that we didn't cover yet?
I think you covered quite a lot. So thank you. And thanks for giving an opportunity to talk about some things. It's funny, I guess maybe I would like to add that, when I talk about persona, creating a persona, or when I talk about being mindful about certain things, it's easy to talk about, but then we forget. So I want to probably add, and I would make it a practice for myself too, is maybe have a checklist of new projects, because talking to you reminded me of certain things that I myself had stopped paying attention to. So I need to start paying attention to those things as well. So I guess, more we do it, more we would turn it into a habit, and then become, just part of my process. So I think, yeah, that's where you have covered a lot. And if there's any questions, feel free to reconnect. But no, this has been great. And I look forward to hearing more and seeing more from other participants as well.
Oh, me too. Well, you were the first, so thank you again. Super appreciate that.